Good morning, everybody. Our panel, the title is Beyond 2%, Quantity and Quality in European Defense Investments. I think if this is the first time you're hearing the phrase 2%, you've obviously been on a very long vacation without access to any public media, especially here in Washington, or if you were in Brussels back this summer during the summit, you would have heard 2% throughout. In fact, we hear about it so much that I don't think anybody, or not many people, really know or appreciate what it means. 2% has turned into a club that we use to beat our allies over the head instead of it being one of several metrics that are necessary to ensure that the alliance has all the capabilities and is able to do what it needs for collective security. So my theme is that it's time for a more sophisticated approach to 2%. Certainly there are several other metrics that could be used. We've heard from the alliance, or some countries talk about contributions, cash, and capabilities, another form of 3 C's, if you will. So that's what today's panel is all about, is a different way to look at what is required to ensure our collective security. I live in Germany, and I would say you couldn't find 5 members of the Bundestag that would be willing to vote to increase defense spending right now, even though most of them know they need to, because they don't want to be seen as responding to the current approach by the administration on 2%. So we've got to figure out a way to incentivize our allies, all of our allies, to continue to invest in defense, but also to make sure the alliance has the capabilities that are required. And certainly, beginning with the Wales Summit, many nations began to change their defense spending anyhow, and we've seen that from several countries, to include each of the countries that are represented up here. We are particularly fortunate to have professionals who have their hands on the defense for their country. The development, the training, the organization, and so on, but also we have somebody from the Office of Secretary General that can help explain what 2%, how does NATO figure what 2% really means. So my objective for today, when we walk out of here in about an hour and a half, that people are energized and want to help expand the argument, the discussion, and we have a more sophisticated approach at burden sharing, at collective security, about what's required. What does the alliance need? I think, for example, we need more German trains, not more German tanks. But, does rail, infrastructure, cyber, do those things count? How do we incentivize so that people invest in those capabilities that we need that are not necessarily traditionally in the Ministry of Defense budget? And so with that, what I'll do, our plan today will follow similar to what Edward's panel did. We'll go right down the line here. And gentlemen, you can speak from the chair or you can come up here. It'll be entirely your call. 6 to 8 minutes each, and then I will come back to each of them with a question, and then we'll move down to the next. And then when we finish that, then we'll open it up for everybody's questions. Minister.
Thank you, Chair. Well, good day, everyone, and thank you for giving me this opportunity to be here today. It's indeed quite a challenging theme. I haven't been in a holiday, General, and since I haven't been in a holiday, I heard about 4%, not 2%. So I'll still referring to the 2% for the moment, and we'll see what's going on. So, Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, distinguished guests, with more than 2 decades of the Romania-United States strategic partnership, and in the context of the Romanian centennial anniversary, it is indeed a great privilege for me to address such a distinguished audience. And I would like to thank CEPA for inviting me to this forum that fosters constructive dialogue and innovative solutions to our emerging and dynamic security environment. Beyond 2%, quantity and quality in European defense investment is a consistent theme, and debating it is not a purely technical exercise for sure. It is about the responsibility and the very essence of defense. It is also about the political synergy between goals and resources and showing unity of purpose. To all these, cohesion, solidarity, credibility, and ability to fulfill the Article 3 and Article 5 of the North Atlantic Treaty are full contributors. Let me share with you my insights starting from the very fundamental reasons that should continue to galvanize allies into investing in defense. Looking back at what the future was supposed to be after the end of the Cold War, we see that today we are inherently unstable in Europe, facing new realities in the East and South. We are experiencing an unprecedented complexity in the security environment. Achieving a new normality in Europe will be difficult. Centrifugal forces are in ascendancy. Therefore, there is a time not only for reflection and assessments, but for decisions to be taken in order to adapt to the new strategic paradigm. New and old hybrid, conventional and asymmetric threats are combined and interwoven from the Baltic Sea region to the Black Sea area, the North Atlantic, the Mediterranean, and from non-state actors or failed states, as it is the case of the arch of instability and turmoil across much of the Middle East and North Africa. The Ukraine crisis demonstrated that conflict in Europe is not a phenomenon of the past. The illegal annexation of Crimea by the Russian Federation pronouncedly affected international law and international order. It actively works against our values and interests. It could be also considered as a transformational momentum that induces a strategy discontinuity. The strategic weight of the Black Sea is now even more enhanced based on the recent security evolution in Ukraine and in the wider Black Sea area. Hence, we are keeping a watchful eye on military strategic developments in this region. From where we stand, 2014 has been a turning point in NATO's approach to its own collective defense. Russia's built-up military posture and aggressive attitude have been recorded in the last period as well, with a heavyweight impact mainly on the eastern flank of the alliance. We believe that along with the Baltic region, the Black Sea region is one of the main pillars of Moscow's assertive strategic posture on its western borders. The unjustified level of military posture, the lack of transparency and predictability, and Russia's aggressive attitude requires unity and solidarity, reflected in a credible, coherent, and effective allied defense and deterrence posture on the whole NATO eastern flank. Still, the unpredictability of the security evolutions and the continued assertiveness of Russia places us in a position to further strive for consolidation of our posture and to envisage the need to deal with the consequences of Russia's behavior in the medium and long term. Mirroring this evolution, I should say that Romania's national defense unequivocally fuels regional security in the Black Sea region. This requires constant and profound adaptation and thus a dynamic approach. While the regional context seemed like a rebirth of the Cold War, the major difference lies on Romania's superior strategic maturity. In other words, Eastern Europe is not the one that the Soviet Union knew and shaped at the end of the 20th century. In such context, Romania today combines relevant economic growth, a certain energy, independency, and a predictable and reliable national defense construct to consolidate its posture as a regional actor and security provider in Eastern Europe. To this, strategic partnership between Romania and the United States remains a must of the transatlantic anchor. After decades of shrinking defense budgets, for the first time since the Cold War, NATO allies have stopped the downward spiral in defense spending. We must work to ensure that higher spending leads for a stronger military posture for the alliance. Nowadays, it makes it more urgent to work together towards stronger and more adequate responses to the current security challenges. All this called into question our determination to consensually fund our national defense. It became crystal clear that this cannot be achieved without the proper defense spending. Romania's vision remains coherent, since we are more than convinced that in order to create an effective defense and deterrence posture in the eastern flank, we have to take defense seriously and to reflect this in our spending decisions. At the last NATO Brussels summit, the heads of state and government reaffirmed their unwavering commitments to all aspects of the defense investment pledge agreed at the Wales summit, including the spending guidelines for 2024, planned capabilities and contributions. The basic principle of equitable sharing of roles, risks, and responsibilities in terms of cash, capabilities, and contributions, the so-called 3Cs, so dear to you, is the foundation of NATO's approach when it comes to the employment of the necessary resources in order to cope with the agreed level of ambition. In Romania, this is the second year of government decision to allocate 2% of the GDP for defense, and we have the same target of 2% of the GDP within an already committed decade. Based on the lessons learned of the last year, for 2018, we planned for the earliest possible acquisition procedures, finalization and payment. Therefore, at the end of this first quarter, the budget execution already accounted for 24%, while after the additional payments planned for the second semester, the budget execution will reach at least 80%. Although rankings are for us a state of fact and not a goal in itself, the constant and appropriate level of resource allocation for the armed forces modernization consolidated our role in the region. The high level of allocation for procurement maintains Romania in the top 3 of the alliance's members with about 35% of the total budget. At the heart of this commitment are the procurement programs. Beginning with 2017, based on an adequate budget that has allowed a qualitative approach to defense procurement, Romania has achieved some real and measurable progress in terms of important equipment acquisition for speeding up the modernization process of the armed forces. I have already said the goal at the end of the day is to translate expenditure into stronger defense capabilities. The acquisition programs will result in a significant capability increases with state-of-the-art equipment, which meant 7 Patriot systems, 3 HIMARS, 227 Piranha 5, 4 multifunctional corvettes, coastal defense system, multifunctional wheeled platforms, and continuation of the multi-role aircraft program. You know, the philosophy of the Romanian government is to reinvest as much as possible in the national defense industry. Our medium and long-term objectives reside in the decision to reinforce the Romanian economy throughout different action on concrete steps. First of all, through all serious investments in the national defense industry in order to adapt to all challenges in our region. Secondly, through know-how and technological transfer into our national defense industry. These are main conditions that stand at the very base of my government philosophy regarding the defense acquisition program. Thirdly, we provide great importance to industrial cooperation and offset. Overall, one can easily observe that all these efforts aren't measured only in quantity terms. All these efforts means quality. Our intention is to create and develop a regional hub for defense industry in Romania. All these government efforts are in the benefit of our country, but also in the benefit of the entire Black Sea region. Nowadays, it is very important to think our national strategy in a broader context, and this is exactly what Romania does right now. In the end, the allocation of 2% of the GDP for defense can be translated into the fact that we recognize the entire important role assumed by the Romanian Ministry of Defense as a stimulator for the national economy increase. Besides the modernization of the armed forces and the increase of deterrence and defense capacity, we affirm the development of our national economy. Distinguished audience, as I mentioned, Romania's strategic maturity relies on the responsibility to adequately commit resources for national defense in order to bolster regional security. Also, our strategic partnership combined with the transatlantic anchor capitalizes on Romania's strategic moment and relevancy. So, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for your attention, and I'm looking forward to the discussions. Thank you.
Minister Fifor, if I could, before we move on to Mr. Havránek, ask kind of a follow-up question. Romania, clearly an exceptionally reliable and effective ally. I remember when President Obama, when we had the so-called Obama surge in Afghanistan, Romania doubled the number of soldiers it had committed. troops there, particularly in Szabó province. So from the very beginning, Romania has done everything you could ask of an ally. Of course, you have a Romanian air defense unit protects the American soldiers in the Enhanced Forward Presence Battle Group in Poland. You have an air defense battery there that the U.S., we couldn't even provide. So you're playing a critical role there. On any given day, there's about 1,000 American soldiers in Romania, either at the logistics base at MK or participating in exercises, and of course the Aegis Ashore missile defense system. So Romania is a leader in the Black Sea region. Russia, and I agree with you that this is the region, I think, where it's of strategic importance to Russia, and so strategic importance to the alliance. What else needs to be done in the region? What type of investments, whether it's organizations that would help the alliance counter Russian maritime capability within the construct of the Montreux Convention, or is it intelligence structures, logistics structures? What other sort of investment would you like to see in the region that would help with Romania as, I think, the anchor probably for this effort?
You know, General, I'm glad that you stressed on the regional context, because together we can deter and defend this part of the eastern flank of the alliance. As I said, and I always said, together, for example, with Poland, I think we can strengthen this deterrence in the eastern flank. Of course, we are together at the Black Sea, together with the Bulgarians, together with Turkey. And I think it's of most value to try to figure it out common programs, common endowment programs, to work on developing this industrial hub together with common projects. I think it's very, very important to discuss also about strengthening the military mobility. This is a very important project for all of us, and Romania is part of this project. And I think that we should work together a lot more in trying to achieve that. And of course, there would be a lot of other investments to be done in the Black Sea region, and our government is trying to do so. Not only what I mentioned already in my intervention, but I think there are a lot of other capabilities which we are looking forward to develop, both for the Navy or for the Air Forces or for the land forces. That is why I said it's, I think, very important to try to create predictability in planning and spending this 2% of the GDP. As you said, I don't think it's only about the 2%. I think it's about much more than this money. It's about good cooperation in the region, and it's about common projects for this part of the eastern flank.
Thanks, Minister. I certainly see General Ciucă here, the Chief of Defense for Romania. He should count at least as 1% contribution just by himself. He's such a good soldier. Okay, our next panelist. Our next panelist is Mr. Jan Havránek, Policy Advisor from the Office of the Secretary General at NATO.
Thank you very much, Ben. And let me say up front that I want to congratulate CEPA on becoming an increasingly strong voice in Washington, D.C., not only for Central and Eastern Europe, but also for the Transatlantic Alliance. I'm very pleased that there's a lot of focus on how we can improve and make better the alliance in the 21st century. And before I deal with some of the details of the burden sharing, let me actually tackle the overarching question of this panel, which is how do we achieve better cohesion in an era of fragmentation? And I want to say up front that cohesion is really the backbone, and cohesion and unity is the really backbone of NATO and the Transatlantic Alliance. And the way to achieve it is to bring all the diverging perspectives and historical backgrounds and cultural backgrounds and political preferences together in the alliance, and burden sharing is one of the tools to achieve that. Now, I want to debunk the myth of NATO being a fragmented alliance, as it's sometimes portrayed. We have to take a historical perspective on the past 70 years. And if you take that historical perspective, you will see that NATO has been an increasingly successful alliance in preserving the peace and stability in Europe. And of course, there have been tensions in the past of NATO's history, going back to mid-50s, when the United States surprisingly would be pressing the Europeans to meet their force goals that the Europeans were not meeting at that time. But there were other tensions in NATO's history over Suez, over Vietnam. Just quite recently, 15 years ago, over the invasion in Iraq. At those times, everybody thought this may be the end of NATO, but guess what? It has not been. I mean, we've always been able to overcome these tensions and come back together because of what NATO represents, the values it represents, and the unique collective defense system it represents. So when we're talking about burden sharing, we really have to also bear that in mind, that this has been a recurring, everlasting issue on NATO's agenda, essentially going back to NATO's founding. It is true that it has been recently more visible due to the changes in the security environment and due to a more direct pressure from the United States, which is a right one. But if you, again, look at the facts, I think not only we've turned corner since 2014, but we've made a major progress when it comes to defense spending. I think it was Minister Lajčák in the first panel who mentioned the overall increase of 41 billion on the side of the non-US NATO allies. But if you look at the achievement over the past 40 years, the figure is almost twice as much. So the trend is positive, and just last year, allies, excluding the US, have spent additional 5.7. The budget increased in real terms 5.7%, and this year we're expecting to see an increase of about 3.5, around 3%, if the trend continues that way. So. When it comes to the pure defense spending, pure cash, the trend is positive, and I'm quite optimistic in that regard. But now, as has been mentioned a number of times today here, it's not just about how much money you throw into the pot, but on what you spend it. And the minister quite aptly outlined the priorities that the allies need to deliver. We need to have forces that have the right capabilities, that are fit for this security environment. We need to make sure that the forces are trained, that they are equipped, that they are organized in appropriate formations, and that they are able to move quite flexibly, in a 360-degree approach, as we say, across the area of responsibility of SACEUR. And so flexibility and capability are the key features of that burden sharing that are equally important. So it's not either or. It's not either cash or capabilities or contributions to operations. In today's security environment, everything really matters. Now, going back again to the notion of fragmentation, I think it's fair to say there has been no major fallout in the alliance. All of the allies have repeatedly reaffirmed the commitment made in 2014 at the Summit of Wales. Since 2017, the allies have been delivering national plans in which they describe how they plan to meet these targets by 2024. Of course, they're the expression of political will of these allies, but I think the notion of the allies having the ownership of that is very important. NATO as an organization can assist the allies through the NATO defense planning process. We can identify those capabilities. We can identify the various other outputs that are necessary. But it's really the ownership lies and the implementation lies with the individual members of the alliance. According to Article 3 of the Washington Treaty, each and every one has to make sure that they have their own right capabilities and also in cooperation, and that they develop them in cooperation with others. So I would leave it as that, and I look forward to your question that's coming up right next.
Jan, thanks. So could you help us understand a little bit, how does the alliance calculate the 2%? I mean, what's the formula? Is it specific, or is it broadly interpreted based on each nation on how they get credit for being, achieving that objective?
Well, the 2% in fact is 2% of GDP. So that means how much money each ally is spending, how much of what portion of the GDP the individual ally is spending on the defense. So it's just one of the metrics. Other allies also, I know that internally, some of the popular national guidances looks at the overall percentage of the state budget, how much of a state budget the individual country pays on defense, and that number is much higher. It's 5% in many instances, for instance. So it's just one of the metrics. It's measured by the size of the population and performance of the economy of one particular country. But as you know, there are also other metrics that go into looking at the overall allied performance, such as the deployability of the forces or their readiness, their sustainability, the level of their training, etc. So I partially agree with you, that the public debate has been sort of fixated on that 2%. In fact, it has not always been the 2%. It's a figure that was not arbitrarily set in mid-2000s based on a median of defense budget spent at that time by the allies, but that number, that median, as it been declining, the 2% guideline was sort of selected the minimum. So it's not, for some reason, it almost became like a ceiling where it's the minimum that is recommended that the allies should be spending.
That's an important point. I think that the 2% is not it gets characterized as an objective that hopefully you can reach instead of it being the minimum. So again, I think that's a part of the argument that needs to.
If I may add maybe one thing, there was a lot of talk about NATO-EU cooperation in the previous panel. Now, NATO does not have any sort of formal legal mechanisms on how to enforce and make sure that the allies meet that guideline. It's really up to individual nations.
So the 2% of GDP that's spent on defense, I think my question, I didn't ask it very well, is what constitutes being spent on defense? Is it only Ministry of Defense budget, or does it include like cyber protection that's done outside of the Ministry of Defense?
Well, it's solely focused on the Ministry of Defense budget, and that accounts for operating costs, for personnel costs, and for investment costs. There's another guideline that's also very much quoted in the public. That's the 20% of that budget spent on investment, which about 15 of the allies, half of the allies, will meet this year, if a country has a robust cyber defense system that doesn't sit under the Ministry of Defense, then we need to look at the way we calculate these kind of things. The debate, of course, goes beyond just purely defensive mechanisms. The wider public debate deals with issues such as humanitarian assistance, etc. I mean, the spectrum of what could potentially be counted as a contribution to a broader security and defense is large. But in fact, the bottom line is really to have the money in the defense system. If you don't have that money, you don't have the money for the investments, you don't have the money for capabilities, etc. It's kind of a theological debate, really. But the problem really is, or the gist of the problem is, that we need to get the right capabilities, and accounting is a way to explain it, but not the part.
If I may.
Sure.
For example, in Romania, 2% is only for the Ministry of Defense. That's the way it is, and that's how the budget is being built. But there is the Ministry of Interior also. There are the gendarmes. There are the emergency situation department. Of course, there are the special services. You asked about cyber. If we are to count what really means defense, of a country and the defense expenditure, then of course you are going a lot more of 2%. It's perhaps 4% or more than that. But usually, and this is already the general idea, is that the Ministry of Defense has 2%, and this is the defense. And it's not only that. There are components in the economy, for example, which can be counted also in the defense system, and they have to be integrated as such. So if we are to talk about Romania, this should be much more than that. And there is a debate in the country about this 2% and how this should be allotted, and what if such an amount of money should be allotted, for example, for the Ministry of Interior, which is also present in Afghanistan with troops and with instructors. I think there we should talk about what really means 2% and how this defense is being built.
Right. Minister, thank you. This is where I really want us to be getting to is what this means, because this is about getting the alliance the capabilities it needs. And as has been said repeatedly, the cohesion of the alliance is the absolute most important aspect of our great alliance. And the way the argument is sort of unfolding these days, I think erodes that cohesion and doesn't necessarily incentivize countries to do more. So making sure that countries are getting credit for what they're doing, to include access, I think ought to be considered. So I look forward to that, and I think probably people out here will have some questions or suggestions about that. Let me go next to the Deputy Minister of Defense from Slovakia, the Honorable Róbert Ondrejcsák. Sir.
Thank you very much. First of all, thank you very much for the invitation to this excellent conference. I cannot emphasize enough how important it is here in Washington to hear the Central European voice and perspective in a city where the whole world competes for the attention, basically. So it gives that extraordinary importance for this conference, and I'm very happy that Slovakia can be a partner this year. It was mentioned several times, this forum was established 10 years ago, and the origin has changed very significantly, and the environment around us has changed significantly. And since that, 10 years ago, we didn't have a robust Russian offensive military posture in Western military districts in Baltic region and in the Black Sea region. We didn't have so strong A2AD bubbles in Kaliningrad and occupied Crimea. And we didn't have that strong political will of Russian leadership to use military force against its neighbors, as the wars in Georgia and in Ukraine demonstrated those realities. Also, we didn't have that very strong will to influence and interfere to our domestic affairs, not only through propaganda and information warfare, but also through different organizations, I would say extremist parties, and in growing scale also through mainstream parties. So it's a very important framework which frames our actions and reactions today. So how we do answer to this situation now? We talked a lot about defense spending and 2%. We have to talk about the people, or to people about those 2%. That is not taken from some crystal ball, but what does it mean? So is that crucial or minimum level which secures some basic development of armed forces capabilities? So it's not just something which somebody invented in Brussels or in some other place of the earth. So 2% are crucial. Nothing, and I emphasize nothing is able to replace investments to defense sector. We had several concepts like smart defense, pooling and sharing, and whatever. But it's very sexy topic. But money is the key. So nothing is able to replace it. Also, it's very important how we spend this money. So to prioritize and to set the proper or appropriate priorities. In case of Slovakia, we do have basically two basic priorities. The first is to meet the capabilities target, which is in case of Slovakia is the building of the heavy mechanized brigade. Previously it was just mechanized brigade, but after the war in Ukraine, basically the situation has changed. So we upgraded it to, or NATO upgraded it, or altogether to heavy mechanized brigade, which we are building now. And the second priority is the Air Force, where we are going to invest very heavily. We are in the middle of the procurement of Black Hawks, and we are going to procure in years to come American F-16s, Viper, which is the latest version of this aircraft. Probably you will see that, or you see that all of our investments which are going to the Air Force are coming to the United States, which is not an accident. We take it very seriously, and we also take it as a potential bridge how to strengthen our strategic partnership with the United States. Besides armament, which is very important, there is one more area where we need to invest. This is the so-called host nation support. It's very nice to have and military mobility. Basically, those two things are which we are dealing very much currently. Of course, it's very nice to have very strong American military posture in western part of Germany. But if something happens in our region, we need to welcome our allies, which are going to help us, and we also need to assure that they are able to come to our territories or to our countries in a relatively with relatively high speed, as the operations in Ukraine basically showed us the speed is absolutely a crucial factor in current military operations. So it was about money and investments, but it's not the only factor. I would turn your attention also to kind of solidarity, which means to understand each other's perspectives. So alliance is a quite huge space from California to the Baltics. And it's absolutely natural that sometimes we have different perspective on different issues, but this is important, or it's crucially important to understand that we are in one alliance and we need to express some kind of solidarity. It's why we went to Afghanistan. Basically, the whole alliance went to deploy our forces to Afghanistan. It's why, for example, we 4 countries, Central European countries, we agreed that we are going to help our Mediterranean friends by investing to buy patrol boats for Libyan Coast Guard, even if we don't feel this very strong pressure what they feel. On the other hand, we expect them, and we are very lucky that this is the reality, that they are going to invest to our region, and they are deploying forces to so-called enhanced forward presence of the NATO in the Baltics and Poland. It's very important to have not only American, British, and those like-minded countries with Central Europe, but also Spanish or Italian troops or French troops in our region. Slovakia is also taking part, by the way, in this initiative. We see it as the most important operation and activity of NATO in years to come. We send a company of 150 troops to Latvia under Canadian command. One would say that 150 troops is not so much, but if we take the whole battle group under Canadian command in Latvia has approximately 1,000 troops, so we are providing 15% of it. Of course, the EFP is not the only thing which is important from this perspective. VGTF, NRF, we talked about this currently. There is a recent initiative of 4x30, which was just adopted in NATO summit recently, which also addresses the time issue and deployability issue in a short notice, which would help our region to be defended in a more efficient way. Last but not least, I would turn also attention to countries and regions which are bordering with us. I mean, with Central Europe. But they are not member of NATO, to Georgians, Ukrainians, and the Western Balkans. We used to say that we form one security complex with those countries, and our security cannot be divided from security of those countries. Some of them are farther in terms of NATO membership. I'm very happy that Macedonia just recently got that momentum, which hopefully will take them to NATO, and it will contribute to the overall stability of Western Balkans. There are countries which are a bit farther from this goal, especially Ukraine and Georgia, but without security and stability of those countries, our security cannot be guaranteed. So just to sum up very briefly, spending is absolutely crucial. Nothing is able to replace it, but also solidarity and mutual understanding between the alliance, and of course leadership in will to be able to express or security interest. Thank you very much.
Minister, thank you. Now, you talked about military mobility, and of course, everybody out here has their coveted CEPA placemat with a map of Europe. Slovakia and also your neighbor, the Czech Republic, are right in the middle of where alliance forces would have to move to react to a crisis, whether it was up in northeast Poland, Slovakia corridor, for example, or if Romania was under a threat. And we're talking about moving peacetime conditions to send a signal to the Russians that do not make a terrible miscalculation. We see what it is. And I say that I believe this would have to be done under peacetime conditions, because no elected official is going to want to do something that looks provocative or escalatory. So you're still going to only have a few days to move, like part of the VJTF, for example, a considerable distance. And that's why this military mobility has gotten such traction inside the alliance, but also, thankfully, within the European Union. And so much so that it's now one of, as you know, one of the 17 signature projects with the Netherlands as lead nation for military mobility. What's needed? What would be Slovakia's role in this? What kind of infrastructure adjustments or investments need to be made? And this is part of the host nation support, which I'm glad you highlighted. What does this look like? Improved military mobility. What does that look like in Slovakia?
Thank you very much. Actually, it's if the previous panel was about NATO, EU cooperation, it's an excellent topic where both organizations can contribute, and really that overlap between two organizations are absolutely there. But what does it mean? In practical terms, it means it has basically two main fields. First is the legislation, basically changes the legislation. Each country, EU or NATO member, we have different legislative framework, how to authorize the border crossing, what to do, which institutions are needed needs to be approached by the alliance or allied. So this is one big issue. So how to harmonize that legislative framework of particular countries, and how to shorten the period which is wasted basically by those legal issues or legislative issues. So the second big thing is the infrastructure itself, which is very tricky. As you know more than me, the infrastructure of the Central Europe and Western Europe differs. For example, just very practical example, our bridges in Central Europe were tailored for the weight of Russian main battle tanks, which are just plus 40 plus tons. So if we want our allies to be able to come and to help us by main battle tanks, for example, which in case of the US means Abrams, it's 60 plus tons. So as our bridges were manufactured for different weight, so it's a very practical problem which needs to be solved. So it's the second thing, and those things are really in the very focus point of this problem.
Right. The Abrams tank, the latest version that General Pascaret talked about today, fully loaded, is going to be about 90 tons.
Wow.
And of course, if you put that on the back of the heavy equipment transport, so you add another at least 10 tons. So and a Leopard will be almost the same weight. So that's a challenge. And so as we think about investments, if we're going to ask Slovakia to strengthen its infrastructure to allow this, then maybe that ought to be counted. There ought to be some formula where that counts. If it has demonstrable real military value, maybe that counts towards 2%. That's something I think we ought to consider. Jan, you had a two-finger.
Very quickly, this is an issue that's enormously important to NATO, how the European Union will handle its dual investment or dual capable investment projects, so to say, and its infrastructure projects. And NATO has been closely working, the staff of NATO has been closely working with the European Union. We've transferred general specifications for infrastructure requirements for the movement of troops, but at the same time, NATO doesn't have any formal authority over the European Union. That's why we need to make use of the fact that 22 members of NATO are also members of the European Union.
Super, thank you. All right, our fourth panelist is State Secretary of Defense for Hungary, formerly General Szabó. Not too long ago was the general. Now your country has decided you can still continue to serve. So congratulations on your new post and in your new uniform.
Thank you. Thank you. Благодарю вами. Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, let me first thank the Center for Ukraine Policy Analysis for the kind invitation to take part in this panel, and let me also add a special word of appreciation for organizing year by year the CEPA Forum, an important security policy event of continuously growing importance. I consider this as a clear sign of the increasing role that Central and Eastern Europe plays in international security and defense policy, a fact that I personally, as a Hungarian, take note of with satisfaction. Let me start with stating that we live in historic times. The security situation Europe is facing is unprecedented since the end of the Cold War. Insecurity and uncertainty are everywhere. To the east, we see the assertive Russia with great power ambitions, and to the south, failed North African and Middle Eastern states create a hotbed for terrorism. Widespread instability fuels massive waves of illegal migration too. Consequently, NATO is under a non-stop strain to adapt to this deteriorated and constantly evolving security environment. This adaptation process started at the Wales Summit in 2014, has most obviously resource implications. We have to find adequate, up-to-date 21st century answers to the new security challenges which have their cost. In parallel, the old discussion about the fairness of transatlantic burden sharing has got new impetus and provokes again and again heated debates among allies. All in all, we are witnessing decisive moments with regards to the cohesion of the NATO alliance. Turning to the substance, that is defense investment, let me say some words on the magic 2% defense spending benchmark, trying to put it into a larger context. The 2% may provide a good hint about the magnitude of national defense efforts. However, I would be very cautious of considering it the only and absolute method of measurement. In other words, I would prefer the broader term of burden sharing to defense spending. While input, the 2% and 20% guidelines is of crucial importance, each coin has two sides. Output is also there. We have to take into consideration the effectiveness of defense spending as well. From a NATO perspective, it is key whether the individual NATO allies' defense budget is spent on military capabilities that are relevant for the alliance as a whole or not. Our nations all have received NATO capability target packages that have to be incorporated into national defense plans and implemented with a high priority. This is the only way we can fulfill our commonly agreed level of ambition relating to collective defense and out-of-area crisis management operations. To put it bluntly, we may find a well-functioning and very capable allied armed forces financed from a defense budget currently below the 2% threshold. On the other hand, avoiding, to name any country, the mere accomplishment of the 2% goal will not necessarily and immediately result in a usable, NATO-compatible and interoperable military. Operational contributions constitute the other pillar of defense output. Evidently, participation in international missions and operations or other relevant engagements, for instance, the enhanced forward presence in the Baltics, is to be fully taken into account. Operations not only have funding requirements, but they may require the blood and sacrifice of our brave soldiers that is inexpressible in financial terms. Let me remind you that more than 1,000 European servicemen have paid the ultimate price in Afghanistan, including several Hungarian ones. To sum up, defense input and output constitute the two sides of the same coin, so they are inseparable. If we are committed to making sound judgments and drawing right conclusions, we have to grasp and consider the big picture, not only the 2% benchmark. We think that the Wales Defence Investment Pledge, adopted in 2014, represents a good compromise in this respect with its three pillars, abbreviated as CCC, that is cash, capabilities and contributions. We are fine with these agreed definitions of burden sharing. As of Hungary, we have been gradually augmenting our defense spending since 2015, and we have committed ourselves to reach the 2% level by 2024, in complete accordance with the Wales Pledge. Although a 4% goal put forward abruptly by the US on the Brussels NATO summit would not be realistic for us, we are open to examine our possibilities to meet the 2% guideline earlier. More concretely, we are on the path of more than tripling the Hungarian defense budget in nominal terms within a decade. Concerning the second financial benchmark, we will spend more than 20% on modernization and major equipment procurement from the defense budget from 2019 and on. And this share will continuously be raised in the following years. As I have already said, output metrics are also very important. In this regard, we have accepted all the NATO force goals that have been apportioned to us and have integrated them into our complex long-term capability development plan, called Zrínyi 2026. We are deeply committed to multinational capability development solutions, which is illustrated by our new initiative to establish a division-level NATO headquarters in Central Europe in cooperation with several allied nations from the region. Last but not least, we are determined to maintain our level of ambition of keeping simultaneously 1,000 troops in different international peace support missions under NATO, EU and UN flags, or in the global coalition to defeat ISIS. As you could see, Hungary is striving to take her fair share from the burdens in every area. On this basis, we feel ourselves as a part of the positive trends that characterize transatlantic burden sharing since the adoption of the Wales Defence Investment Pledge. After several years of austerity, we have also managed to turn the corner. Let me also briefly provide you with some insights into the capability development-related dilemmas and difficulties of several former socialist countries, such as Hungary, that later joined NATO. At the outset, we had a mass army based on conscription with heavy equipment. Throughout the 90s and the first decade of our century, we have dramatically reduced our high-end capabilities for two main reasons. Firstly, budgetary constraints, and secondly, the NATO advised to concentrate on the development of flexible, highly mobile, deployable, light units and niche capabilities that the alliance can easily make use of in out-of-area crisis management. However, during the past couple of years, since the outbreak of the crisis and the armed conflict in Ukraine, the enhancement of collective defense has raised again to the forefront of Allied attention. Many of our defense planners have felt confused about this quick shift in priorities. In the past 2 decades, we have basically lost our heavy capabilities and, in parallel, our ability to manage complex military procurement and investment projects. After going so long to the direction of crisis management operations, It represents an enormous challenge for us to restore our territorial defense-related capabilities. These zigzags rooted in history are difficult to follow for small Central European countries. Of course, we are trying to do our best. The new vision of the Hungarian Defense Forces set out in Zrínyi 2026 program is an army placing equal emphasis on light, medium, and heavy forces, the so-called three-brigade concept. We are also paying great attention to the emerging security challenges like cyber. A military cyber defense center has recently been set up in Hungary. We have also established an extensive voluntary reservist system focusing on homeland defense in order to complement the capabilities of the professional military. The most recent good news is that we have acquired military transport planes and signed a contract on the procurement of state-of-the-art flight multi-purpose helicopters in an effort to modernize the Hungarian Air Force. The bottom line is that the changing security environment requires a changing approach to defense. The best way to maintain allied cohesion is the correct implementation of our consensual decisions. Hungary has heard NATO's call, and the Hungarian defense forces are on the way of sustainable development, which offers a historic opportunity and creates a serious challenge at the same time. Each ally is different. Economically, politically, geographically, demographically, militarily. Thus, instead of the rigid application of standardized methodologies, we should never lose sight of solidarity, the core value of the alliance, which can take various practical forms. We say yes to the just need of a fairer transatlantic burden sharing, but we say no to considering the 2% guideline absolute and exclusive. I thank you for your attention.
So, State Secretary Szabó, thank you. Another aspect of burden sharing, I think, is that some countries have started to highlight is taking on responsibility in areas where the United States either doesn't have the capacity to go or maybe doesn't quite see the same urgency in it. And Africa is what comes to mind immediately. You know, the U.S. presence in Africa is it's very small compared to other places. And yet there are thousands of European soldiers under EU mandate or UN mandate or other missions. And that is in my view, would seem to be a form of burden sharing as well that doesn't get recognized as part of a 2% thing necessarily, but yet it's part of helping with our collective security, and I think that ought to be included in the conversation. A place where Hungary has stepped forward that I think did not get the attention it should is in the KFOR mission in Kosovo. When Portugal withdrew, Hungary immediately stepped forward to fill the gap left there. So burden sharing is more than just financial aspect to it, and I think that's the theme that we're trying to expand on. The air base, Papa Air Base in Hungary, I think is a good example of where pooling works, or centralized air transport as well. So Hungary's in the middle of all of these things. Could you talk a little bit about the other aspect, though, of the transition you're making? You alluded to it, from old Soviet equipment, Soviet-style equipment, to a modernization. What's the challenges that you have to deal with to make that modernization transition?
Yes, to start with the Kosovo issue, it is important, you know, that the KFOR area is one of the traditional areas, you know, for the Hungarian efforts, you know, in the Western Balkans. If you remember, we joined the first IFOR mission, you know, in Bosnia as a PFP nation, and then, you know, in 1999 we joined the KFOR mission, you know, as a NATO country. So it was a big difference, you know, at the time. As I mentioned, you know, we have around 1,000 troops, you know, abroad at one time, but I'd like to say that almost 60%, of this personnel, those guys are in the Western Balkans, both in Bosnia and Kosovo. So that's why, it was a logic step, when it came up, to fulfill the gap, in the K4 Tactical Reserve Battalion, that we assumed, the nation who will lead, this formation. The second issue, concerning our obsolete military assets, from the Soviet area. Yes, it is a very good question. If we are talking about our budget, we should spend a lot of money, to keep those assets still in the army. It is necessary because we started, the procurement of new assets, but it takes time, and that's why we have to bridge this gap between getting rid of the obsolete technique and the new military assets. And that's why it was a story in Hungary concerning the helicopters. Of course, for the time being, we have Soviet-made helicopters, in the army, in the air force, and that's why there was a need to refurbish, those assets, until we get the new helicopters. What I told you, during my presentation. So it is a very, very complex area, and we have to be ready, to handle, this situation, and to be ready, for this transition period, which can be, years. Okay.
Okay, thanks very much, sir. Okay, I think what we'll do now, we've got still about 20 minutes where we can open up for questions from the audience from this fantastic panel. And what I'd like to do is take two at a time, okay, and then we'll answer them, and then we'll come back. So I see John Denny and right here. Okay, and if you would, please, when you stand up and ask questions, just identify who you are and who you represent.
Thank you, Ben. My name is John Denny. I'm a research professor at the U.S. Army War College. And my question is for Mr. Havránek. Some analysts, including myself, have written that, frankly, the 2% goal is not very useful. Among other things, it doesn't measure outputs, obviously, and it's also fairly arbitrary. Luckily, NATO has a measure for outputs. It's called force usability goals. But the alliance has refused to make those things public, even though as recently as the Wales Summit, the alliance recommitted to them. And again, those goals are basically 50% of your land forces should be deployable, and at any given time, 10% should be either engaged in or earmarked for sustained operations.
Correct.
So can you describe for us, or shed some light for us perhaps, on the status of that effort to make those usability goals public? I mean, after all, the alliance is not above naming and shaming. It does that with the 2% goal now. And if there's no sign of hope for that, can you also shed light perhaps for us on what the main arguments are for those who don't want to make it public? Thank you.
Thanks, John. All right, and over here.
Great, thank you. My name is Gergely Varga from Institute of Foreign Affairs and Trade in Budapest. I would like to connect the panel with the previous panel. So a lot of discussion on common procurement, PESCO, European Defence Fund. Do you really see a momentum now for common European large defense projects? I mean, looking back, we see that, well, common procurement programs haven't really been a success story on a European level. But now, do you really see the momentum, the circumstances for larger European defense projects, looking at the current PESCO projects? And also connected to the question, do you envision and do you support much greater German leadership as we look at today's European defense environment? Of course, we cannot really envision a robust European defense potential without greater German leadership. So do Central European countries and Central and Eastern European countries really would like to see Germany taking up a larger role in defense? Thank you.
Super. So, Jan, if you'll take the first one, and then I'll ask the three ministers to each of you to address the second question.
You know, there's sort of a blur between NATO, the alliance, and the allies. I'm going to answer your question, Mr. Denny, but from a wider perspective, you know, and we also heard it in State Secretary Szabó's remarks, you know, that these are, you know, arbitrarily decided metrics, etc. So I want to make it clear that it's actually the allies, the individual member states of the alliance that decide on what kind of metrics there will be, first and foremost, and second, whether they will be made public or not. And as you know, NATO as an organization, the decision-making is done by consensus. That means all 29 members have to agree on any kind of decision, including whether a document is made public or not. So it just takes only one country to block the call to make these things public. That said, however, some of the individual nations have transferred on what is called the metrics report, which is a classified document in the alliance, onto their national statistical reports, and they make them public individually. So they declassify them on their own national level and publish their statistical data, more detailed statistical data that includes the categories that you described based on their decision, which also adds to the overall peer pressure, as you put it. Could more data be public? Sure, why not? At the same time, you know, it would increase the transparency. It would contribute to better understanding of the whole problem of defense spending. But at the same time, it's the individual member states. NATO as an organization, it's not some sort of a regulatory monster that decides or imposes something on the allies. It's the allies themselves that have to agree. So that's how the effort stands, you know. And once in a while, there is a proposal to make some of the more data public, but at the same time, if one ally says no, then it's a no.
John, is that okay? You bet. Okay, then for the way we'll do this, then, Minister, if you don't mind, we'll just go right down the road to address the second question.
Well, all three of us are coming from states being part of the European Union also. And we all witnessed lately discussions about how not to duplicate NATO and the European Union efforts to create a Europe of defense, as it is known already. Well, I think, and I always argued, that we cannot discuss about a European defense without the transatlantic bond. And Romania is firmly staying on this statement. Without all the efforts from the transatlantic board, we cannot discuss about the transatlantic defense here in Europe. On the other hand, of course, we have to discuss about common projects. We have to discuss of interoperability in between the European Union countries. And we have to discuss of how can we not duplicate efforts in each and every country when we talk about endowment programs. And of course, there would be a great idea, that one of trying to interconnect these efforts. And I think this is what PESCO is intended to be, to work together in projects, to work together towards spending money much more efficiently in the European Union. I don't think that we should talk about who's the leader in that, because being part of the European Union, we all know that we work as member states with the same rights and with the same obligations. And on the other hand, perhaps we can think of a stronger European Union inside NATO, but not duplicating NATO. And this is how Romania stands firmly on this.
So I think part of the question had to do with on the German leadership. I took it as meaning increased German defense spending, an expectation of that. Is that about right?
Well, I think every NATO country was part of the Wales summit decision to spend 2% from the GDP for defense. And I think that's the case for every country, and every country should try to do the effort to reach the 2%. This was a discussion also in the summit in Brussels this summer, and I think we all agreed that this should be taken into consideration so that we can talk about burden sharing and collective defense. So I think this should be how it should be considered, this position.
Thanks, Minister. Sir.
Yeah. Just few sentences why we are so enthusiastic or relatively enthusiastic about PESCO currently. I remember the different European initiatives in the field of defense and security in the last 20 years, and a majority of them were tailored to somehow push the United States out of European defense architecture, or kind of lowering the American importance in European security architecture. Now, excuse me, it's not the case. First, PESCO doesn't have this strategic level ambition to create something independent European army or those things. The PESCO is a very practical tool how to solve some problems which are necessary to be solved. We talk about military mobility, for example. We are talking about medical command in Europe, or for example, our project, Slovakia is leading one of the first 17 projects in PESCO, is the so-called Euro artillery, how to harmonize the long-range precision strike capability. So PESCO is tailored to solve some very practical problems, but it's not tailored to create some autonomous European army, and and of course not to weaken the transatlantic link. So I see certain political and also expert momentum for PESCO currently, because we identify so many shortfalls what we have currently in Europe, and we welcome any possible tool which is able to address them. And PESCO looks like could be one of those tools. About the German leadership, we are not afraid of strong Germany in Europe. The opposite, we need strong Germany, also militarily strong Germany. If we want to be able to defend ourselves, we don't have any historical troubles or some sentiments about this. It's of course it's a German political decision, domestic political decision. We watch it very closely, what we are discussing in this field. For us, Germany is a natural European leader in terms of economy and politics, and we would not be afraid if Germany would be stronger in the field of military. Of course, it will not replace or something like this the exclusive position of the United States, but it could be a nice complementary factor.
All right. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. Concerning the PESCO, I'd like to highlight, that PESCO is a unique opportunity, to our national defense industry. And that's why, it's very important to have those PESCO projects, on the national agenda, because I guess that it is a very good chance, to progress our national defense industry. Concerning Germany, I'd like to say, that we have very, very good relationship, with our German colleagues, and actually we are really interested, as it was said, in a very strong Germany, and also in a military way. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, I had a question here, and then in the middle, and then Mika. I think those will be our three.
Thank you. I am Volodymyr Dubovik from Odessa University, Ukraine. First of all, comment. I would like to thank everyone on the previous panel and this panel for your support for my country of Ukraine. We need it in the testing times that we are still living through, obviously. And thank you for your personal input and contributions, and for the support coming from your corresponding governments. Also, I think how we define what's going on there matters. Whether you call it Russian aggression against Ukraine, or whether you call it armed conflict in Ukraine, there is a sea difference, in my opinion, and that's a big, meaningful difference, which matters. My question is on what Peter Doran mentioned in his opening remarks, among other things, his hope that there will be a permanent stationing of American troops east of Berlin. Obviously, Minister Čaputovič mentioned that in his presentation, that being part of the formal position and a request of Poland for that to happen. And I would wonder what would be your positions on this issue, anyone on this panel, including from the NATO HQ. Do you see it as something which is timely, which is needful, which is feasible? Thank you.
Okay, and then question in the middle.
Tomasz Mroczkowski, American University. Actually, this was very similar to my question, which is aimed at General Hodges, but also to the other panelists. As you know, we've had a rotating presence in Poland and the Baltics, but since this is an achievement, but the Russian capability since has increased even faster, as the various war games show. And I think that's the background from which the Polish president proposed something he called Fort Trump, a more permanent presence of the United States in Poland. This actually has caused a certain amount of controversy and different reactions. So I'd like to very much hear what the panelists' reaction is,
Okay.
whether it's a good idea, bad idea, etc. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, and then the third question was right here on the aisle. Thank you.
Michał Baranowski, GMF4. So we are all thinking alike. So I'm not going to ask the question about permanent basis because this was exactly my question. I guess we are all really want to hear about it. Maybe on the conditions that would be for your countries that would have to be made if this is to go forward. And maybe I can pop a question to you, General Hodges, a little bit. On, we are meeting now in September after the NATO summit earlier this summer. I mean, for some allies, maybe particularly Western allies, it was seen as politically bruising summit. Politically, because the decisions themselves were very good, as you have all said. I wanted to get your sense of how the debate in DC has changed or not on NATO, on burden sharing in particular, but the time that has passed over the last few months. Mm-hmm. Thanks.
Okay, I think the way we'll do it, and this will be our final round, is on the topic of permanent basing in general. Okay, and what I'll do is just start at the end with State Secretary Szabó, and we'll just come down, and I'll ask all four of you to comment on. Is it a good idea, or what would be the repercussions, the implications? How should we go about it if we're going to do it?
Yeah. Concerning the permanent basing, we are working on the DCA agreement, with US at the moment, and it can be, a basis for going forward, with this issue. But for the time being, I don't see, the possibility and the need, for permanent U.S. presence, especially in Hungary. I don't want to talk about other countries. Okay.
All right.
Yep. Basically, we are talking about potential American permanent presence in Poland because it's the only thing which is close to reality or closer to reality than in other countries. In general, we welcome any step which contributes to the security of our region, and it would contribute certainly to the security of our region. Of course, there is a difference between permanent and rotating. There is already an American brigade in Poland on rotating basis, which is another step to EFP. So it's on bilateral basis. Plus, there is a NATO presence there on EFP under American command. So we perceive it more as a bilateral issue between Poland and the United States, but in general, it would contribute to our security, I would say.
Okay. Yeah.
to build up on what Robert had said, I mean, permanent stationing would essentially lead to a static deterrence and defense posture, replicating a Cold War type of deterrent. And I think we've established today that the security environment in which we live in has changed completely. And our deterrence and defense posture has to be both efficient and effective. It has to be credible. It should not increase, it shouldn't contribute to increasing tensions, but at the same time, we need to be able to deliver on collective defense throughout the entire area of operations across all domains, which requires a lot of flexibility. We need to be able to reinforce in any direction in order to be able to respond to any challenge, not to one particular type of scenario. So that we have to bear in mind, when we're discussing a presence of Allied troop on any kind of territory. So that's why we have come up with rotational presence together with the National Defense Forces and reinforcement concept, which is so far the right one for the current security environment.
Well, I think one of the basic principles of NATO is that defense starts at home. And I think each country of NATO, including Romania, should think of how to strengthen its own capabilities and its own capacity to assure defense and deterrence, for example, in the eastern flank in this part of the Black Sea region. On the other hand, of course, we talk about a collective defense. And of course, we have this special strategic partnership with the United States. We have United States soldiers in Romania, both in Mihail Kogălnicianu Airport and in the Veselu. And we praise a lot this partnership with the United States, and we welcome it. On the other hand, as I said, we think about collective defense, and not only about the United States, but all the other countries which has to take part in this effort. If I am to think only about the multinational brigade, for example, in Craiova, there are Polish soldiers, there are Portuguese, Germans, of course, Americans, and I think this is how it should look like. But again, starting from the idea that defense should start at home and to think, what can I do to increase and to strengthen my own capabilities?
Thank you, Minister. So the cohesion of the alliance is, to me, the ultimate, most important thing that has to be preserved. And so any decision a bilateral decision by the United States with any nation that was taken without consultation of all our allies and bringing all the allies forward, I think will erode that cohesion, because there will be a Russian response. In fact, I would predict that you could, within days, there would be Russian troops in Belarus. And so all of our allies will have to deal with the consequences of this bilateral decision. So I think it's to the benefit of the alliance, and the burden is on the United States to make the diplomatic case that overall security is enhanced if the United States were to decide to accept it. And there have been other countries that have made similar offers or have asked for permanent presence. All the allies would have to deal with the consequences. And so I think we're much more effective and much more powerful when this is done in an alliance way. When you think of the Warsaw Summit, which had to be one of the most significantly important and successful summits that the alliance has enjoyed in decades, the thing that came out of that was this transition from assurance to deterrence, and the fact that all 28 nations, of course this is when Montenegro also joined, all 28 nations signed up for the Enhanced Forward Presence Battle Group. I mean, everybody agreed that this was the right thing to do, and it was so powerful. And I think the idea of permanent basing, if you had all 29 nations agreeing to it, then I think that would be extremely powerful. Poland, no better ally. Kudos to them for this offer. I know that it's being seriously considered. I think the last National Defense Authorization Act, the law, tasked the Department of Defense to examine what would be required, the feasibility, and so that's happening. But I hope that if we do move forward with this, that it's done within bringing all of our allies with us, versus doing something that would, I think, erode the cohesion of our great alliance. I think if you named it Fort Hodges, it'd have a much better chance of getting some momentum. But I mean, we have a Fort Pulaski in Georgia, so we ought to have a in the state of Georgia. Let me conclude here. So much of the deterrence capability of the alliance is based on speed. It's not just having tanks or ships or jets or troops everywhere. It's speed of recognition, speed of decision, and speed of assembly. How fast can we recognize what's happening? Because it won't be like what Lieutenant Hodges thought it was going to be, a long line of T-72 tanks coming over the horizon. That would be easy. The world's greatest Air Force would take care of that in one day. But it's going to be something that will be very, very difficult to recognize and to determine by design. So we've got to be able to recognize what's happening. We have to be able to get a decision to start doing things, to start movement, to pull Patriot missiles out of depots. And all of these things are going to be done in peacetime conditions where people are going to be doing everything. They're going to start tapping the brakes immediately. Our leaders will, correctly, because we don't want something to escalate and get out of control or be seen as provocative. But yet we still have to be able to send a signal to the Russians that we see what you're thinking about doing. Do not make a terrible mistake. Our great alliance will respond. But if we can't get there, if we can't move fast enough for the VJTF or other forces to be in position in Suwalki Corridor or somewhere in Romania or somewhere else in the alliance to demonstrate that we can move as fast or faster than them, then I think the risk of them making that terrible miscalculation goes way up. So that's why this military mobility is so important. It is a capability the alliance needs, but it doesn't fit in anybody's Ministry of Defense budget. But yet we need almost every country in the alliance to improve infrastructure, to improve transport capability, to do things that allow all of us to move more quickly. And so I think if we're serious about military mobility, then maybe we can incentivize countries that are reluctant for whatever reason to spend more on defense. Every member of Parliament, Congress wants to improve infrastructure. So it seems like there ought to be a formula where you get credit towards your 2%, even though it's outside of your Ministry of Defense budget. There ought to be a formula for that. The cyber, we all fly in German airspace, Polish airspace, French airspace, Italian, but yet the cyber that protects air traffic control or seaports is not under anybody's Ministry of Defense budget, I would be willing to bet. But yet it's absolutely essential for all of us to conduct military operations that are part of our collective security. So again, I think taking a look, having a more sophisticated look at what counts would be a worthwhile effort. Okay, I think what's going to happen now, somebody from CEPA tell me if I'm wrong, we're going to move. There's Reka, thank you. How about for this panel?
Can I ask